Thank you. You know, many times we make sacrifices to see performances and all those kind of stuff, concerts. But we're giving you this one live and direct. This one is free. This one is the special item delivered to you by Sister Celia and Sister Delisha. Welcome.
Happy Sabbath, everyone. Water you turn into wine. Open the eyes of the blind. There's no one like you. None like you. Into the darkness you shine. Out of the ashes we rise. There's no one like you. None like you. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. Into the darkness you shine. Out of the ashes we rise. There's no one like you. None like you. Our God is greater. Our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer. Awesome in power. Our God. Our God. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. And if our God is for us, then who can ever stop us? And if our God is with us, then what can stand against? And if our God is for us, then who can ever stop us? And if our God is with us, then what can stand against? Then what can stand against? Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, oh our God. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, oh our God.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's no surprise that we're now in the Christmas season, and it's not hard to recognize what's happening around us. And a lot of times it can feel like we're at the lower tier party, and the good party is happening somewhere else. The good party is happening uh, outside of us, and they're the ones that have the better experience. Perhaps they have the better holiday. And it can impact the way we think. And it's sometimes good to step back and take a look at how things got to this point. Many times, if you're not good with your money, at some point down the line, you have a problem. And you may seek assistance, and someone will come and look at what transpired from beginning to end, because they're trying to figure out, how did you get so jacked up? And when they look at your books, when they look at your papers, when they look at your taxes, they could see what went wrong. And sometimes we ourselves don't see it in the moment, but it's clear as day when you look at records. And we have a record of human society, human exchange with God. And so we're going to take a look at that today. You could turn to Ephesians chapter 1. Ephesians 1 encapsulates the whole process that we're undergoing, that we're involved in. Ephesians 1 and in verse 3, it says, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in the heavenly realms with every spiritual blessing in Christ." This process where we see God the Father exist in tandem with Christ and working with us and developing our character so that we become more and more like God. And in the process of doing this, we've been given abilities and functions so that we can operate in a spiritual capacity and being able to relate to God. Continuing on in verse 4, "For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight." And so we see God has reached out to mankind prior to even the world being created, before the world's existence. And it was understood that these things were going to take place, that God was going to have this kind of relationship. Continuing on, "In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will, to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has freely given us in the one he loves." And this exemplifies the logistics of how that would be done, where Christ would offer his life as a ransom, as a payment for the sins that mankind has committed that would have naturally, organically, normally separated them from God. Payment was made so that restitution could be established and man could have a relationship with God the Father. You see all of this taking place in these verses. In verse 7, continuing on, "In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins in accordance with the riches of God's grace that he lavished on us." And further, we see that that process is cemented by our sins being forgiven, by Christ dying, by his blood being shed. Also, that the holy days, they picture all of these steps that are being spoken of here. "With all wisdom and understanding, he made known to us the mystery of his will according to his good pleasure, which he purposed in Christ." And this mystery is something that everyone is privy to, but those that God has selected to work with throughout mankind 6,000 years would understand. And they would be fashioned by this process in which God would work with mankind. And without a doubt, it certainly is a mystery. But there will come a point in time where it won't be a mystery any longer. It's going to be common knowledge. And it will become evident by the fact that it comes to fruition. It comes true. I can't tell you how many times when I was younger that I pictured being able to do something, accomplish something in the future. And it just so happened I had to recount such a time. to someone this week. And as I recounted it, it coincidentally was something that I was able to take part in just the day before I was telling that story. Once upon a time, I was a lot shorter than I am now. I was severely height challenged. Um, Many would just attribute this to just being the normal span of growth. I was a kid. And when I would ride the bus with my mother, I would not be able to reach the top bar in the bus, particularly the handles. Back then, here in New York, they had handles. There were these metal bars that would swing back and forth. They kind of took them away. They don't have them anymore in the city transit system. But man, it looked like so much fun. I could not wait till I was tall enough to hold on to those bars. And I guess I was the size of the young people that we have in the room right now. What they working with? 3 feet? Yes? Okay. So I guess I was in that same span of height. And I tell you, I could not imagine ever being able to reach those things. I don't know what happened. About 40 plus years went by, and I think it was Wednesday or Thursday. I was on the bus, and it wasn't the New York Transit system. It was another bus company. So they had the handles, and I was holding on to the handles. And so the following day, I was speaking to someone younger than me, and I was recounting how time passes and how you can look forward to the future and, and, and in hopes of being able to perform in a certain manner. And as I'm telling the story to someone 30 plus years younger than me, it occurred, wait a minute, I was holding on to the handle the day before. Didn't even recognize it. The time came and it became evident, and I was able to perform in the manner in which I hoped I would have been able to when I was younger. It's bittersweet because, like I said, I had to spend 40 plus years in order to be able to do that. Was it worth it? It is what it is. The years have been spent, but I held the heck out of that handle up. I worked it. Likewise, what we have here before us is a time period where we will be able to fulfill what we're reading about when it becomes true. In verse 9, he made known to us the mystery of his will according to his good pleasure, which he purposed in Christ, to be put into effect when the times reach their fulfillment, and those times of fulfillment are coming and are in the future. Continuing on, if this will ultimately, as it says, bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth under Christ. This is the goal. This is the theme and mission statement of the whole Bible. This is the gospel. This is the good news. This is what all the holy days break down in steps. This, I dare say, is what is supposed to bring joy to the world. This is what is supposed to, what you find to be a musical rendition of a jingling of bells. This story, this account, is what you would find to be, in its occurrence, the most marvelous and greatest time of the year, of the moment, this process. And so we see when we look at the holidays how there's this infusion of celebration and recognition and magic and wonder and mystery. And all of these things are derivative of this process. Now, when you look at this process is not well known. And it's Satan's goal to make sure that this process is obscured, is hidden, is not understood. And there's no better way to make that possible but to create an alternative choice, so that less will come to this way and be misdirected elsewhere. For every Coca-Cola, you have a Pepsi. For every Superman, you have a Shazam. For every McDonald's, there's a Burger King. This is with intent. It's on purpose. You can look at musical artists, you can look at television shows, and you'll see copycats. Who came first? You can figure it out, but all the things I mentioned were copycats. And, and this is what we're exposed to. So for individuals and as people, as we think and rationalize, as groups of people, as families, as nations, as societies and cultures, this is what's happening. And Satan, it is his intent to divert us from this good news, from this iteration of celebration, from this recognition. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, we see those common scriptures where we're told what his motivation is. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4. The God of this age, right now, Satan has control of this world. The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Part of that gospel, part of that good news is what we just read in Ephesians. It captures all of that. And so, what better way to deceive people than to create another story, another thing for them to embrace. Revelation chapter 12, we see the same. We see his intent and what he's trying to accomplish in the manner in which he does that. Revelation 12, in verse 9. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. Other translations will say he deceives the whole world. And so we see around this time others celebrating another version of what we saw in this account is something for us to be happy about and celebrate and look forward to. And so you look at what they're celebrating, and you look at how they approach their holidays, and you look at some of the trappings and the songs that are associated with the holidays, and the things that they're singing about sound marvelous, and the smells that you associate with that, and it's all just good things. Well, those are imitations of this gospel. If you could associate good things with this gospel, this is what it would be. And Satan, the best he could do is to come up with chestnuts on an open fire. And it smells kind of nice. I cannot get down with nuts. I don't know if chestnuts are in the nut family. I've never tried to rock them. I don't think I would like it. But when I would go to the city as a kid and you go to see all the decorations, I could appreciate that smell of the nuts roasting there on the street. The colors and the costumes and all the things associated with it. This is the best Satan can do to try to imitate the real thing to be happy about, the real thing to be excited about, the real magic behind it. Not Santa Claus, not a dude in a red suit that commits all sorts of violations, misdemeanors, and felonies by breaking into your house in order to get gifts, give gifts, leave things under the tree. It's like, really? And this dude has powers and means of functioning, that magic and mystery. That's all Satan trying to copy what and who God is. The lights, well, it looks very nice and it's very impressive. But all the people could do with Christmas are exhibit external lights. Now, if you were to try to tell these people that by obeying God and allowing these changes in mind and function, that the time will come where they will be transformed and they will be lights themselves, it's a hard sell. No one's going to believe. But this is what the Bible says. Again, all we see are Satan's imitations and the stories that go along with it and the specials. They're so endearing and inspiring. But again, imitations of the real stuff that no one understands. And the very stories that are meant to inspire, the whole text that we just read, they get swept under the rug. No one's singing about that. Hallmark, the TV channel, is not going to make a zillion specials about how to embrace God. It's just not. But all of this Christmas stuff, well, if you can't find a boyfriend and you're a dude and you just can't find a good woman, you watch these Hallmark specials around Christmas, it's just, matchmaking a plenty. Again, that's not the truth. It's being hidden. The real connection that a man is supposed to have with God, that a woman is supposed to have with God, it's being hidden. And the best Satan can do is create this alternative. We continuously see this extent of duplicity. Another choice, another way that is not the best way. You ever on the top floor and you want to get out, you want to go home, you want to leave, and you're waiting on the elevator and it's taking too long. If you have that physical condition, you take the steps. But a time will come when you can't. People tend to think that choices are good, not when they're wrong. Not when they're wrong. And God does afford us choice, and we have options of choices and more and pertaining to things of minutia. Does God care what color shoes you wear? Does he? But again, what's more important is, are you going to live in a way that's going to connect you with God or obstruct God and further knowledge and understanding? And that's the kicker. When it comes to options that are made and that duplicity and those alternative means of pursuit, we can see an example of that in 1 Kings. 1 Kings in chapter 12. 1 Kings chapter 12, in verse 26, we see an example of something that took place when Israel and Judah broke apart. The king of the remaining tribes that composed Israel at that point in time were led by an individual named Jeroboam. He was the king of Israel. And you had a alternative king of Judah. Alternative is not the word that I wanted. I'm not going to trouble you with trying to figure out what that word was. And it's going to annoy me because I can't pull it out of my brain. And from the looks of everybody's faces, if I pose that question, I don't think you guys will help me, and it will probably pick up the rest of the sermon. No, that's all right. It's going to derail everything. And it's right there, and I can't pull it out. Nevertheless, Jeroboam, in verse 26, thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. He's looking forward to the holidays, to the feast, and he's thinking, when the feast comes, everyone's going to continue to keep the feast, go to Jerusalem. They're going to have a good time and realize, why did we break up? And he's going to lose his kingdom. If these people go up to sacrifice at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their Lord. Rehoboam, king of Judah, the son of Solomon, who was the present king, the alternative king. No, that's not the word. When someone is your equal, the equivalent. Okay, I think that's where I was headed. Hey, Mr. Engineer, Mark, I came to a resolution you were totally unaware. I think it was equivalent, the equivalency. All right, for those of you at home, absolutely no help. Everybody here in the room. Nevertheless, the equivalency of that position in Judah was Rehoboam, and Jeroboam felt that if these people are able to go and celebrate the way they're supposed to, according to God's law, they're going to turn away from him. Verse 28, after seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." The alternative, the competing factor, another choice. And he set up a statue of a cow, what I guess would be disrespectful to their gods. He set up a statue of a calf, but that's what it was. It's a cow. Did you think there was anyone in Israel who was like, dude, really? A cow? Not necessarily. These things were common among the people of the day, and they had connections to other gods, and there was a culture behind that. Verse 29, one he set up in Bethel and the other in Dan to accommodate people traveling. He made it so they would be able to have an alternative means to the true God by going to these places instead of going to the feasts. Jeroboam built shrines on high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. And so he put out an edict. Look, who wants to be a priest of this new religion? It didn't matter if you were educated or not. And not only that, he paid very well. And so these people came and they were trained in this new religion. And they were able to do pretty good. And as time went on, as there was other economic problems, people began to see these false priests are living good. Let me go join and have a good job. And so this religion began to grow, this false religion that obscured the true God and kept people from going to keep the feast in Jerusalem. And this is the sort of thing that Satan does. This is the way Satan behaves. And this is what has been going on for thousands of years until we get to this point that we're in now. But mind you, I mentioned how sometimes you may have a professional come and overlook your books, your finances to see where did this problem arise. And you see how it develops. You see how you get from point A to point B. If you've ever had a crack in your windshield, sometimes that could be costly. But that little crack, and it'll be a tiny little crack, and it'll look like a little splinter, that crack will grow and grow and grow until ultimately that windshield will just shatter. And it could take years. But in the time that you may have a vehicle, depending on the environment that you're in and how cold it is outside and such, that crack will grow exponentially. And it'll be hard to imagine looking at the end result of how that windshield can crack as to how it started with just a tiny little splinter. But this is indeed the same thing that has occurred, and the same thing that we're looking at today. And so now we look at the holidays and we see the festivities, and it's hard to imagine what this grew out of and how we got to this point. And in all honesty, it can look and be presented as rather innocent. Doesn't seem that bad. Everybody's having a good time. It's just for the kids, right? It obscures God. That's what it does. That's the most important thing that it does. And no one even realizes it. And all the things they celebrate and all the things they sing about and all the good times, all the goodwill towards men and peace on earth. They don't realize that these are just emulations of the real thing, the real deal, and the passage that we read in Ephesians chapter 1. That's the whole gospel right there from verse 3 to about 11 or so. That's what is to be celebrated. That's what we're celebrating during the feast and during the holy days throughout the year. And people don't realize that's the real celebration. That's the thing you look forward to. And that's what Satan is trying to shroud. In Genesis chapter 3, it's always a good place to turn to look at the beginning and see examples of things that preceded us to understand where we are at today. As I've mentioned before, many may look at Genesis and go, that book, that whole collection of books is so boring. These guys don't know how to dress. Their manner of clothing is such that I can't relate. And the way that they think, the way that they talk, there's nothing that I can relate to, and there's nothing that I can garner or glean from these stories. They're just out of date and can't be related to. And this is entirely not true. And we could see a lot of examples of where society came from and where it's at today. And by doing that, we also begin to see how real God is. God was real then, and God is just as real now. And we see how these alternatives sprouted up and just became extremely popular in the way that we see today. And I might add, people will look at some of the decorations and such that we have today and go, there's no harm in that. There's no harm. And they don't make a connection with that. And they may very well go, look, I could care less about Zeus. I'm not doing this for Zeus. I'm doing this because, yeah, it's a little fun. It's just a custom. I'm not going to, take an animal and slice his neck, and they probably wouldn't even bleed it. They would probably offer it with the blood in it and do this in the name of Zeus. Not at all. They don't do that. And why? They don't need Zeus. You go to the supermarket, get you some food. You don't have to pray to the gods for food and prosperity. You just go to work. You don't have to pray to the God that you may choose for your health. You just go to the doctor, get you some health insurance. We don't need gods anymore. We are God now. We took the place of those gods. We don't need Zeus. We don't need Hera. Forget her. The girl don't know how to act. We can do this ourselves. And all the other gods that may exist, all the other gods of old, we don't need them. We are gods. And this is the mentality. We worship ourselves. We worship the things we make. We worship our famous idols. And so we've taken that place of God. And many will go, I'm not doing this for these other gods. I could care less that it comes as a pagan derivative. I'm not thinking about any of their old gods. Baal. Who? I'm not thinking Baal. My name is so-and-so. I'm more important. And this is the way people think today. And these have become our gods ourselves. And so, when we look in Genesis, we begin to see how this occurred and continues to occur today. We come across Satan, a story that we hear all the time, talking smack, trying to kick it and deceive Adam and Eve. Successfully, but take a look at how this came about, and we'll examine some of the attributes that we still see today in this storyline. In Genesis chapter 3 and in verse 2, story that we read all the time, to the point that you can tell it with your eyes closed, I suppose. And here we have the woman talking to the serpent. And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die. She understood what was said. Satan then counters with an alternative way of looking at things, an alternative way of approach. If you can't pay your cable bill, there's another provider that would happily give you cable. If Time Warner, I don't think Time Warner is what it's called anymore. Help me out, people. Spectrum, thank you. I was about to get on you guys. Spectrum is a cable company that we have here in the New York area. So if you don't pay Time Warner, you don't pay Spectrum, you could just as well go to DirecTV. There's an alternative. When you don't pay DirecTV, well, Dish, if they're still around, can help you out. But to be quite honest, you don't need cable anymore because now everybody has all these apps. Cable is antiquated. It's defunct. So you don't need to pay your bill. So if you were to, although this is not the purpose of my talking today, if you were to use any of the speaking that you hear for financial direction, let it be known, you ain't gotta pay your cable bill. Let it go. You ain't gotta pay it. There's another source. And so in our lives of daily convenience, we have other sources of addressing our needs. Even though we don't look, most don't look to God to supply our needs, because as I said, the manner in which we approach things, we are gods ourselves. Nevertheless, Satan offers to Eve an alternative approach. She is stuck on God said don't do that. God said don't touch. God said we can't eat. Girl, stop it. God said no. And Satan begins to say, you will not die. You're not going to die. For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Mind you, Satan always combines truth with lie, which is what he did. And he tells her, this is not true. Think for yourself. Abandon, God said, don't do this. God said, no. Think for yourself. Go and step back. Try it again. And she did. She stepped back, and she tried it again. Verse 6. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food, she steps back and begins to reason. Well, probably tastes good. And pleasing to the eye. It looks nice. She's reasoning. And also desirable for gaining wisdom. This is what she's computing. Except in the first iteration, what was a part of this computation was God said, don't eat, don't touch. Satan convinced her to leave that part out. Don't claim this. You don't need to claim that. Yeah, granted, it's like $30,000 of income, but you need to pay taxes on that. Write that off. It's fine. You don't even need a receipt. Down the line, you will have a problem when it's exposed. And so Satan convinced her to use her own reasoning, not God's instruction, to pivot to functioning of herself, in and of herself, where she removed God, stepped in his place, and reasoned for herself. She became God for herself. And so she took and ate. She also gave some to her husband who was with her. This brother, talk about having a woman wear the pants. He did not intervene. He didn't stop her. He's like, well, baby, listen, maybe you want to think about that, what you're doing? No, not at all. And he ate too. And the Bible says in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 14, Adam was not deceived. He too let this happen, stood there, and ate as well with her. Knowing it was wrong, Eve may have been genuinely tricked in her rationale by abandoning what God said. When she stepped away from what God said and tried to reason it out on her own, it wasn't going to make sense, which is dangerous. When you remove God and try to come to the same conclusion that God would have you come to, but without God, just of your own wisdom. And the next thing you know, you eating pork sandwiches and fornicating left and right. Because it's like, this is the best way to be healthy. But when you put God into it, you have a little bit better direction. And your choice of vitamins and company become a little bit more streamlined and therefore healthier. By doing that, Adam became, by using his own reasoning, like, I can't lose this. I'm very connected to this, more so than God. Eve became a god to him. He became a god to himself. They removed God and replaced that space with themselves. Dropping down to verse 14, we now have a verdict where everybody gets told their punishment. And so Adam and Eve and Satan are all standing there. And God says to Satan in everybody's presence, so the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life. The emphasis of this is not strictly like Mr. Snake, because you did something bad, you're going to lose your feet. Now go on, get out of here. It's not about that. It's not about physical composition of a physical organism. It's about Satan losing his position of authority over the planet, over the beings that were there, over humans, over even the animals. Now, cursed is Satan above all livestock. So the goat, the cow, they got a lot more going for them than Satan does when this comes to fruition. And so this is what this is saying. He will crawl on his belly and eat dust, but you're going to be lowest of the low. You see something similar in Romans 16, verse 20, that God's going to bruise. Paul is talking and he's telling his listeners God is going to bruise Satan under their feet. It's the same verbiage is being used. But no, this is not about a snake losing his feet. It's about Satan losing his position. Continuing on, verse 15, and I will put enmity between you and the woman. There's going to be a problem. The woman would have an issue with Satan, which she did. She had a problem with what happened, and there was disdain there from the woman's point of view towards Satan. There was bad blood, if you will. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. God told Satan in another translation that there would be a problem, there would be an issue, there would be tension between Satan's offspring or Satan's seed and her seed, Eve's seed. He said to Satan, you're going to have a problem with her seed, not their seed, not Adam and Eve's seed. He said her seed, singular. And this is turning into a messianic prophecy. He didn't say their kids. He said her kid. And this is what they're being told, that someone is going to come and rectify the situation that just got created. They went and jacked everything up, and now there's a problem. They're separated from God. And that separation from God, they can't think in a healthy manner. And it became evident immediately. The very things that picture what we saw in Ephesians chapter 1 are now skewed. We read in Paul's writings that marriage represents a relationship between Christ and the church. And the first thing that went south was how they viewed sex, how they viewed their nakedness. Immediately, boom, that was hit on. and addressed so that that's not going to be understood. Everything that they could have understood before is now shrouded. They lost um, access. They didn't have that kind of security clearance any longer. God continues, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, between your seed and her seed, singular. He, not them, singular. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel, revealing that the Messiah will come, that God will come down as a man and perform something that will thoroughly dismantle Satan's position, crushing his head, ultimately leading to his demise. Yeah. And in turn, Satan will strike his heel, which would be relatively insignificant in terms of what the Messiah would accomplish by their affront, by their offensive move. Now, this edict of what's going to happen was made in the presence of Adam, Eve, and Satan. This story that a woman is going to give birth to a child that is from God, a child that is God, without being sired by another human being, which is what is encapsulated here. And they understood, all three of them. And when we read it, it seems like it doesn't make sense. But I want you to know, I watch many people in this room that grew up in another area than where I came from. And there are times where people share a common slang or common idioms, a common language. And you guys are talking to each other, and it makes no sense to me whatsoever. But the people that are talking understand. It makes sense. And even though it may not make sense to me, those that are in the exchange, they're understanding. When they stood there, they understood. So we come around and we read it and go, oh, this doesn't make sense. So it's not true. Oh, this doesn't make sense. So it didn't happen. This doesn't make sense. Therefore, they didn't understand when it was being said to them. Not true. They understood, and going forward, this understanding continued. Likewise, I sit here and I may listen to others speak amongst themselves, and I don't understand. I watch people laugh. I don't get the joke. Does that mean it's not funny? 5 minutes later, somebody tells me what was said. And I'm like, oh, yeah. That was funny. But I couldn't share in it in the moment. But what reveals itself was there was meaning behind what was said. It had intent, it had purpose, and it resonated when I was able to process it. Likewise, this stuff here, it was making sense to them. It made sense to Satan. And he, in turn, took that, and you see all sorts of, oh man, I hate it when that happens. It's happening again. What's it called when you steal something and you copy it as if it's yours? Plagiarism, thank you. You guys are good today. Satan took this and plagiarized it in an attempt to obscure what was going to come in the future. Many times you will have historians, you will have people that call themselves scholars or are deemed so, and they will say that many of the stories in the Bible can't be true because you could see aspects of it in other cultures that came before the formal organization of writings were put together. To them, they go, these things were evident in other cultures before the Bible was assembled. And so everything in the Bible is a lie, and the Bible is pulling stories from other cultures to make a point, and all of it is untrue. When in actuality, Satan took this. He heard what was being said, He heard about the Madonna and the child. He heard about the mother and the son. He heard about a Savior that will come. And he took it and he flipped it and he sold it. And so you see this in all these other cultures. So by the time we get down to today and you look back, you don't see how the linear progression. You just see where you're at and go, all of this is nonsense. That's not true. And so Satan continuously takes aspects and flips it and makes another story out of it. Not only did Satan hear what was being said, Adam and Eve did as well. Now, the rest of the time that I'm talking, I may cite or I may not cite and just add it to what I'm saying, but I'm going to let you know where I may get some of these things from if you may not see scriptural accounts of some of the inferences that I may make. There is a historian whose name is Josephus, and many have attributed a lot of truth to what he has said down through history. He's accredited with detailing a lot of the things that happened in the first century in terms of things that were going on in Christ's day, things that were happening after Christ was crucified and ascended, and how Israel dealt with Rome, and how Rome subsequently attacked Israel, attacked Jerusalem, and ransacked the area. He gives a lot of firsthand reporting that is corroborated. In addition, there's a lot of information that he may share that would have been passed down orally or in other works. And so Josephus makes mention of a lot of the things that happened in antiquity and in the past and even in these days. And a lot of times it's supported by folklore, but he's been viewed as someone to take as having some sort of substantial merit. Yes. And so there will be times where I may cite things that he said. For example, Josephus has said that Adam was well aware that in the future his world was going to be destroyed by a flood. And after that, the world would then be destroyed by fire. There are these oral accounts that many of the men and women that followed God were aware of some of the things that God was going to do. Some of them have some scriptural references to it, where people of old are mentioned, and I may mention them as I continue to talk. But nevertheless, just the same way that Satan heard what was being said amongst them, Adam and Eve heard it as well, and particularly Eve, and it resonated with her. Because remember, there's now enmity between her and Satan. She doesn't like him. She is not favorable towards him and did not like the way things went down. Did not like how now their whole outlook is screwed up. And she was looking forward to a Savior, to a Messiah, to someone that was going to come and fix what they honestly did mess up, Adam and Eve. And so when we continue on through Genesis, we see how this is affecting her thinking. Genesis chapter 4, verse 1. I am reading from the NIV translation. It says, Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. And she said, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. And so right here, we have a story where we see that she became pregnant and she gave birth to Cain. But when you examine the Hebrew, you can come to see that there may have been a little bit more into what she was saying. When you look at the Hebrew, it's possible to translate what she said as, I have gotten a man, comma, the Lord, showing or reflecting her thinking that this was the Messiah. This was God. This was going to be the Lord. This was going to play out as that role that was going to fix things. And even when you look at the other translations, even the one that I just read from, some other translations are a little more pointed with this version of a translation, where I have, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. With the help of the Lord, with the help of God, with God's assistance, I have brought forth a man. I have created a man. I have made a man. I have acquired a man. But her thinking is like, look what I did. Look what I just made happen. Yeah, God helped, but I am assuming a big role in what's happening. The very thing that screwed her up the first time is this sense of me and the reliance on themselves, which is something that would have been exacerbated having been separated from God's spirit and now more influenced by Satan and the power of the air that he controlled. You would begin to see this display. And so, again, we see this occurrence of possibly recognizing God, but also going, I can be God myself. I'm God. I can do this. I can make this happen. I don't need God. Now, mind you, this is kind of a holiday sermon, right? In terms of how we are looking at the world. And these are the beginnings of how these things built until we get to what we see in the world's holidays. And this is where it starts, and then it just grows. And so at this base, we're seeing what's in her mind. Remember how Satan manipulates things and how things will transpire going into the future. He knows there's going to be a Madonna and child that God is going to utilize to have his seed come into the world, and he's already starting with Madonna, Eve. And now there's another iteration of it with Cain. But continuing on, and in verse 2, she said, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. Later, she gave birth to his brother, Abel. When you look at the Hebrew in verse 2, another inference can be made. The other translations will say she bore again, which means she had another birth. But when you look at the Hebrew literally means she added in bearing. And that phrase can be meant to imply that she had twins. And this wasn't a separate pregnancy. And so Adam and Eve may have been twins. Interesting. Just a test to see if you guys are on point. You guys are doing well. So I'm not the most comfortable right now. And then maybe it shows. But nevertheless, I start to get and I don't mean like I'm nervous. I mean I have some discomfort, and but nevertheless, I'm working through it, and so maybe I'm getting the names mixed up. But it's good to see you guys are on point. Nevertheless, getting back to what I was saying. Who are these kids again? Thank you. Cain and Abel were working. For those of you at home, if you're taking notes and you wrote down Adam and Eve, just scratch that out. We're going to go with Cain and Abel here on out. In verse, breaking into verse 2. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. So Abel appeared to work with the animals, and Cain was like a farmer or a gatherer. And when you look at Josephus again, there are reports that, for one, when we look at the possibility of how Eve may have been looking at Cain, just picture how that what that could do to your psyche, the way he's raised, the way he grows up. If he's being told initially that you could very well be the Messiah, you could very well be the one to herald in a change and fix what your father and I messed up. How's that going to work with his thinking? How's that going to affect him? Nevertheless, it appears that Cain was not very obedient to God, and that he was actually an evil man. And in being a farmer, he didn't obey God's rules. And he may not have obeyed the agricultural rules that were an extent then, and that we see to be an extent by the time God is talking to the Israelites. And we see that they're laws that Israel is meant to follow in terms of grooming the land and how they did things agriculturally and how they let the land rest and so on and so forth. Cain is not obeying that. He's just simply out for gain and is ignoring that. Verse 3, in the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. When you look at the Hebrew, that phrase, in the course of time, it can imply that, I think it says in the end of time, or at the end of days, it implies that that was the Sabbath. Again, interesting were these things to be the case. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. Again, this requires some more breaking down. And we see that Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. He brought grains to the Lord. He brought a thanks offering, which is essentially what this was. And that's it. When you look at some of the other translations, you see that Abel also brought an offering, and then it goes on to explain that there was a meat component to it. And that also is indicative of the fact that Abel also brought a grain offering like Cain, but accompanying that, he also made a sin offering with the animal. He offered an animal. He sacrificed an animal. There was a sin offering. Abel acknowledged that he had sinned. Abel sought God's grace. Cain was like, I didn't sin. There's nothing wrong with me. And he just offered a grain offering, which is why God had a problem with Cain's offering. Again, when you just read it, it doesn't seem to make sense, but this is what's happening. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. He looked upset. He was not cool with what was going on. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? Like, just do what you're supposed to do. I told you, you bring an offering, acknowledge your sins, ask for repentance, seek my grace. Cain is like, no. Cain may have been raised with the perception that he was somebody important, that he was practically as good as God. He put himself in God's place. Now recognize what's happening. This is all worship. And you see the difference in the worship. You see Abel's worship, it's true. It's authentic. But Cain is now putting a twist on his worship, a twist on how he approaches God. Same God. I mean, you can't get any closer. God's talking to you directly. And still, with the direct communication, he still can't worship God the way God said to be worshiped. He has his own religion. He has his own style of worship where he just excluded the sin offering. It's just a thanks offering because he's so full of himself. He is now, like his mother and Adam had done before him, put himself in the place of God. He now has created another form of religion, another approach. And the derivative of this will begin to affect the holidays and customs that come down from this. You see the change beginning and starting already. Now, many will assume when they read this story that there's just four people walking around and they got the whole world to themselves. That is not the case. It's just Adam and Eve and two kids. And what? They're in high school? Or they're homeschooled? They're teenagers? No. Adam and Eve had other children. And there was a population. We're told about significant points going through this story, but there are other people. And they're reproducing like rabbits. And so you do have a population that's existing. Now, again, Josephus alert. Josephus said, or is written, that, well, let me read verse 8. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. A lot of the things that I bring up, you will have notations in your Bible as well to some of the things that I mentioned when I talked about that prepositional phrase that reflected that it could have been the Sabbath, or some of the other phrases about I have gotten a man from the Lord, things like that. There'll be little notations to point out that there are other translations, or there's another way of looking at this verse, or something was added or taken out or not put in. So here in verse 8, now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. In the translation that's most often used, there's nothing there. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, and it's blank. Let's go out to the field. That was put in. And you have other translations in the Hebrew that are a little older or around the similar age that have different iterations of what was being said. But Josephus fills in that the details of what this paraphrase represents, what may have been going on, that Cain went to talk to Abel and they had a discussion. And Cain is saying to Abel, God is playing favorites. God likes you, and he doesn't care for me, and he's showing favoritism. I don't think that's fair. And Abel responded, listen, all you have to do is just obey. God shows attention to those that obey him and those that follow him. And Abel responded that God is definitely merciful to those that obey. And Cain didn't take to that. And that's when he killed him. And you can see in 1 John chapter 3, verse 11, that in Cain, that indeed Cain was evil. And Cain was focused on himself. He was focused on putting himself in the place of God. And he obscured the proper approach to God and taught that. As we read, we'll see that Cain goes off and he lives his life, but there's no detail. Again, Josephus fills things in and explains that Cain was actually a powerful man, a man of note, a man of recognition in his time, and he was evil. And Cain established cities, and Cain had mannerisms about him where he leaned towards violence and stealing, and stealing from others by force. Nevertheless, we'll read God's exchange with Cain. The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground," implying that Cain may have buried Abel. "Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I could bear," or rather, like, is my sin too great that you can't forgive me? It's like, stop it. It's not real. It's not sincere. He's not sincere. It's all fake, this fake form of approach to God. He didn't care and only thought about himself, and he just leans into this self-pity, but he really wasn't about reconnecting with God at all. "Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence." It was recognized what was happening. He was going to be disconnected from God, potentially from this kind of one-on-one conversation. "I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. Now, what's happening here is Cain was concerned that, somebody was going to get him. There was going to be retribution. Remember, there's more than 4 people on the planet. There is a whole population in existence. And remember, these guys, they're not living for like 20 years and then they have a stroke and die. These dudes are living hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They're people that are walking the earth, that they've been reproducing. There is a population. And what you begin to see is there will be lines of heritage. So Cain had a number of kids and would have had a lineage of children, as well as Abel. And they would have had brothers and sisters. But Abel would have had a line of kids himself, and grandkids and great-grandchildren. And that line derived from Abel going down would probably take issue with what Cain did and be looking to get their licks, be looking to get Cain back, and he was concerned about that. And so God explained to him, all right, if anyone were to touch you, then there would be a curse on them 7 times over. Not meaning you can't be killed, but rather he was going to make the penalty so strong that if somebody did kill him, maybe it would dissuade people from doing that. And then people get the sense that Cain couldn't settle down anywhere. And not entirely so. He built cities. And there were cities built with the concept of sin, with immorality, with this false religion that he carried. And yes, indeed, he was cut off from God, as he said. He wasn't really concerned because he didn't obey God. But what he wound up doing was creating another religion where there's a hidden God that he no longer has contact with in that manner. And we begin to see this religion sprout up of a hidden God, of another approach to God. And we begin to see this become even more existent as we go through history. Verse 17, Cain made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. This does not mean Enoch was Cain's firstborn, not at all. Cain more than likely had a number of other kids, and life had gone on in time after his exchange with God. What this does mean is around the time that this particular child was born, Cain had established a city. And again, we begin to see, especially when you combine some of the things that Josephus is saying, that Cain was not an obedient man to God, and that he pushed a religion and a way of life that did not reflect who God was. Continuing on, we begin to see a couple of other shout-outs reflecting Cain's lineage. As Cain lived and had other kids, these men grew into positions of prominence in the pre-flood world. And they're being mentioned because they're men of note. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Mehuel, and Mehuel was the father of Methusal, and Methusal was the father of Lamech. And these men, when you look at their names mean things that aren't really positive towards God. When you look at the meaning, I guess I could read off some of their names. So let's see what we got here. Irad means fugitive. Enoch gave birth to Irad, fugitive. Irad gave birth to Mehuel, which means smitten of God. And when you start to look at the folklore, he did something that made God kill him. And we don't know what he did. Maybe he tried to organize some sort of like, let's go back to Eden, and tried to go back into the Garden of Eden. Some say stuff like that, and God killed him. I don't know what he did. Mehuel gave birth to Methusal, and this means man who is God. Remember, there is a strong theme of people going, I am God in this period of time. I don't need God. I'm God. Methusal gave birth to Lamech, and his name meant powerful. And Lamech is an important person in the pre-flood world, very important. He was a very powerful man. And Lamech, and it goes on, and there's other names and such. But continuing on, verse 19, this is all fashioning the world to see how this world is becoming evil as it goes on, and how a religion is being started and an approach to God that isn't according to the way God would have himself worshipped. Verse 19, Lamech married two women, one named Adah and the other Zillah. Adah gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. So, Jabal, again, these men that derive from Cain, or Cain's line, they're all disobedient. They do not follow God. And what you see going on, he was the father of those that raise livestock. Father, when you look at the Hebrew, is more like a teacher. And he taught people on how to, raise animals, or ways of taking care of animals and fashioning campgrounds and things like that. But he's doing it in the way that's against God. So when you see some of these men and they're dealing with the land, they're approaching the land, but not obeying the agricultural laws that God said, and thereby evoking that curse that came out in I think it's Genesis 3, verse 17, where God is telling Adam that because of what you did, you're going to have to deal with thorns and things like that. The land isn't going to produce food for you. And Cain also was told something similar, meaning that he's able to plant, but he probably is not able to stick around to benefit from what he's planting. He kind of had to stay on the move. He probably didn't have a good reputation after what occurred. And so I'm sure people were looking for him. And so this is what's going on with Jabal. He's not living right. He's a teacher, but teaching ways that are contrary to God's ways, especially in terms of raising animals. Nobody's living by God's ways, at least not according to the line of Cain. Verse 21, his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who played stringed instruments and pipes. And again, he was a musician, and he probably trained others into playing music. But again, remember, these people are not obeying God. So this is the profane music. This is, the sinful, fornicative, baby-making music that we got going on here. And the type of music that does not honor God. Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Tubal-Cain made weapons. Tubal-Cain was a warrior, and he conquered peoples around him in their society. This is what's going on. No one's living right. Another point, when you begin to see these individuals, it is said that these individuals are the basis for the mythological gods that we see come to fruition post-flood, and the Zeus, and the Hermes and the, I don't know, what's the Roman version of this? Odin? Yeah. You know, all those other gods. These people they're based on real people. They're based on people that were not obeying God, that had talents and professions as we see here. But when you read the Bible and you read the Old Testament, a lot of times people don't understand it. And they're wondering, why am I reading this? Why is that here? Why do I care? How is this important to the story? These men were prominent men, but they did not obey God, and they stemmed from the line of Cain. Lamech, another man, very powerful man, who was looking to have a dictatorship and a world-dominating influence. He wanted to be the top dog and rule the world as it was situated in his time. He wanted to be emperor, if you will, and have a kingdom. And so, again, this man is very powerful, as many of these men were. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to me, wives of Lamech, hear my words. Hilarious. Nobody talks like that. But he's beginning to say something to himself. I'm sure, and excuse me for using your name and personage, but I'm sure Tehran does not talk to Celia like that. Like, listen to me, Celia, wife of Tehran. No, brother, just say what you gotta say. Needless, he speaks, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. So Lamech is now admitting he did something wrong. He got in some sort of trouble. He's telling his wives that he caught a case, and he's probably above the law. But many can attribute this to mean several things. Perhaps all at once, maybe there's man, I hate it. It's happening to me again. When things can happen twice, there's a duality to it. So, some have said that he may have been the one that killed Cain, for whatever reason. Cain was also a powerful man, and to be, from the third man of recognition like that, from Adam and Eve, he was going to have some prominence. And as I said, Lamech wanted that prominence. There was going to be some tension because he wants to be top dog. And something must have happened. We had to take Cain out, and Cain was killed. Another possibility, as you continue to read on, he says he killed a man for wounding him, and he killed a young man for injuring him. He may be talking about Tubal-Cain, who also was seeking power. But in addition, he may have been referring to Enoch, another individual that we will begin to touch on in a moment. Enoch is of a different line, a different lineage. Cain has his lineage, which is what we've been focusing on. But there's another lineage that we're going to get into. But he may have killed this other individual. But here's the thing, how people view themselves as gods. God said any man that killed Cain, would be have a curse on him 7 times 7. But Lamech is so full of himself that he's going to now issue an edict, as if it has any power, that whoever kills him should be avenged 77 times. Like who are you to say such a thing? He puts himself in place of somebody important. God never said that. He said that. And you see this continuance of people constantly putting themselves in God's place. Now, drop down to verse 25, and we go back to what's the word? When you're telling a story, and the story resumes. What's that? No. When it's just a continuation of a story, and I can't remember the word. Come on, guys.
We're just throwing out words, you just get madder. No, you're
Okay. Chronological. That's the word I wanted. I wanted chronological. All right. So now, when we get to verse 25, we had a little inset, and it talked about the line of Cain, powerful men, rulers that were sinful in the pre-flood world, derivative of Cain, and Cain's way of thinking, Cain's religion, Cain's approach to God, which people are cut off from God with Cain's approach. It doesn't work. They don't know the true God. Now we resume the chronological flow in verse 25. Adam made love to his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. And so now Seth's name, it means, what does it mean? I don't think a replacement is the right word. It means appointed compensation. You know, he was another, Eve saw him as in place of Abel. And he resembled Abel in the way Abel behaved, in the way Abel thought. And so now we're going to begin to see a line of people according to Seth, Seth's lineage. Those according to Seth's lineage, this family obeyed God. These people continue to obey God and keep God's ways and keep God's laws. Cain's line didn't. Cain's line assumed the wrong way of life. They assumed this new alternate religion. But Seth's line stayed true to God as we continue to read. And so we get to verse 5 and verse 1. There's a kind of like a rehashing of everything that's happened. And when you get to verse 6, you begin to see the lineage. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. Enosh, also had kids. Let's see. Seth had Enosh. And Enosh, his name means mortal man. And you may figure, what's the point of that? How's that significant? Remember, a lot of people at this time are calling themselves gods because they're going, we don't need God. And look at verse 26 of Genesis 4. Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh, which means, as I said, mortal man. And then next verse, or rather continuance of that verse, at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This may have several meanings. It may mean people began to write things down and begin to have some form of writing like that. But there's another way of translating that. And in so doing, at that time, people began to call themselves gods. This is what's happening here. Yeah. More specifically, those of Cain's line. They're rulers, and they're calling themselves gods, and they're displaying that, putting themselves in place of God, and they're emulating that and putting this out into society. This is the influence that they are establishing. Countering that, Seth, who's obedient to God, has a child, and he names him mortal man with the recognition that man is not yet a God, not yet born into the family of God. And we see this line as it goes through. Enosh has a child, Kenan. Kenan has Malal, which means blessed of God. Malal has Jared. Jared has Enoch, which means teaching. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 5, we see that Enoch preached to the people of his day that the Lord was going to come with thousands and tens of thousands in his army. He spoke of things that were going to happen in the future. And look, here we are, and it still hasn't happened yet. But these men spoke of the things that God was going to do. They obeyed God. Remember, we have the line of Cain, obedient to God, prominent. They're the ones in the control. They're the ones ruling things. And then we have the line of Seth, obedient to God. They don't have as much power as the line of Cain does. And so you read about all of these guys going through. When you get to Enoch, you see that he was a righteous man, and he was taken away, or he had an early death. And you'll also see other references, I believe in Jude chapter 1, verse 14, maybe that's what I was citing before, that he would come with tens of thousands of his army. And then Hebrews 11, verse 5 is just recognizing that Enoch was righteous, as most of the people of Seth's line were. And so you go through all of this, and you go through that line of Seth's descendants. Remember, all these people are obedient to God. When we get down to verse 25, when Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of Lamech, a different Lamech than the one that's in Cain's family. After he became the father of Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years and had other sons and daughters. And then it says he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he had a son. He named his son Noah. So we get down to Methuselah, and we look at Josephus. It seems that after the death of Enoch, Methuselah changed and became disobedient and started to drift the wrong way, away from God. And now Cain's family, they were the ones that were disobedient, and they were the ones that were in the ruling powers. And Methuselah and those that came after him began to intermarry with Cain's family. And so by doing that, they're now taking on the habits and the approaches that Cain and Cain's family and descendants were promoting. Yeah. That's something that God would not like. He didn't want his religion compromised and combined with a sinful religion, a sinful approach. Now, going forward, as I quickly try to sum things up with what I have left, there are things that I may touch on that can be controversial in the sense that people have alternate views about what this may mean, alternate views about how they see things and how they see the lineage derived. And I will quickly try to address it. I probably won't get through everything, and I will sum up what I'm trying to say. And if there are questions, maybe we could do some sort of a study on it where it doesn't turn into a fight where we start throwing things at each other. Nevertheless, so going forward, verse 6, chapter 1. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Now remember what I said, as chapter 6, verse 1 of Genesis. As I go through, you're going to start to touch on stuff that other people may have different views about. I'm not going there. I'm going to issue a certain approach only because I'm looking to get to a certain destination. Yes. And I will quickly get to that, but I'm going to define things according to the approach that I'm using. That being said, the way that I would explain this, when the human beings began to increase in the number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, those people that were calling themselves God, yes. The line of Cain, the people that said, hey, this is, and again, people may not agree, but mind you, I have to use this, else my sermon doesn't make any sense. So if I don't, then when I get to the end, and I'll give away the ending, I'm headed towards Nimrod, because this is Christmas. I can't get to Nimrod. Using all those other techniques is going to jack me up and it's going to derail me. Because we're going to hit a couple of other bumps when we get to Canaan. I'm going to get derailed. I could care less about Canaan. I want Nimrod. So I have to show people how I'm looking at it in order for me to make a point about today's society. I'm not interested in all the other stuff. Other stuff, yeah, I could care less about. Nevertheless, according to how I'm defining things. And so, if you look at it from this point of view, and you have the line of Cain saying that they are gods, they begin to intermarry with Seth's line of obedient descendants. And so they begin to marry the daughters of the humans. This is what that is referring to. And they begin to intermarry. And again, Methuselah started that towards the end of his life, and it continued, and God was not pleased, according to this approach of the narration. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal, and he shortens their lifespan, because things are starting to go awry. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, the giants. When you look at the Hebrew, it doesn't mean giants like Jack and the Beanstalk. It means men of note, men of prominence, those that would fell others, slay others, great warriors. These important people, again referring to the men of great prominence in Cain's family. These men, these giants, these important people were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards when the sons of God, same people that put themselves in the place of God with this false religion, went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They began to intermarry. In so doing, they're now contaminating God's truth. And now God's truth is becoming diluted. And now even those of Seth's family were going to be led astray. God was not feeling that. They were the heroes of old, referring to these men of Cain's line. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil. With this narration, it does seem to make some sense. There are other approaches that people have that may be a little harder to comprehend. With this narration, you see the breakdown from God's way of life and how the true way of life is being strayed from. Continuing on, you see the account of Noah, who's also of the line of Seth. And, Noah is said was a wealthy man. And he also preached to the people the need to obey. And, you had to be a man of means in order to make a boat and take on a project like that. And so, skipping through there, going through Noah, and now we see that, you have a group of people. Here comes another trigger, but only for select people. I almost forgot. Chapter 5, verse 32. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That does not mean that. This means by the time he was 500 years old, he started to have kids. And we see these kids, and it appears to be in ascending order because Japheth was the oldest. There's nothing in here that says who was older, Shem or Ham, but anytime you see them mentioned, they're mentioned in this fashion, and you may come to think that Ham is the middle kid. Necessary because, again, the direction that I was originally going for, I'm going after Nimrod, one of the grandkids. But in order to do that, as I go through the next chapter, I'm going to wind up, and I won't have a lot of time to touch on it, wind up talking about something that came up before. And so I'm using an approach to facilitate the point that I'm trying to make. I am not contradicting anyone else that spoke. And I am not saying that anything else was improper. There are other approaches that people use. Yes. What I am showing is that there was a breakdown in how people began to stray from God. And even the few obedient ones in the line of Seth were having difficulty. And so yeah, we got some kids. Now we're on the boat, and then after the flood, they get off the boat because the world was corrupt. And let's see, where am I at? Now, keep in mind, the people that were on that boat, not everybody was righteous. And it never said everyone was righteous, but we know Noah was. Yeah. We also know that after the flood, the humanity did split up, and there were there was a dispelled, and they went to different parts of the earth. Folklore or Josephus and others will say that Noah was a good part of taking different peoples and having them become colonizers in certain areas, settling them in whatever areas that God would have had them go. We also know that the Tower of Babel was an incident where mankind had their language confused. And so now you have all these different cultures. And all of these cultures, there's a story of the Madonna and child in all of them. In all of these cultures, there's a story of a flood in all of them. So it's not the Bible that took from those stories. It's that these stories all originated with what was happening then. This false religion that existed then, with Cain establishing it, continued to grow back after the flood. Yes. And that's where I was headed. And lo and behold, now that I finally get close, that's when I'm going to stop. Nevertheless, I won't be able to talk that long or much about it, but going through that, at least to clear up what I was trying to get to, I mentioned anytime the sons of Noah are mentioned, it's in ascending order. And it's verse 18 of chapter 9 of Genesis. The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Out of nowhere, there's an insert that says Ham was the father of Canaan. Why is this in there? Why is Canaan being brought up? He's not a part of the story, but he's being introduced because he's going to become an integral part of what's being said. As I drop down, this is where we begin to have another iteration of how things are seen, where verse 22, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backward and so on and so forth. There's this accusation among many that will think that, somebody violated Noah. In terms of how I would look at that, I would assume that may have actually happened. But whoever the perpetrator is that offended Noah, it doesn't appear to be Ham. When Noah, verse 24, when Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, because Noah got drunk, fell asleep, and now it says he wakes and he finds out what his youngest son had done to him. The youngest son, there's still another a school of thought that sees this as youngest son, meaning not his immediate kids, but his grandkids. His youngest grandson would have been Canaan. Now, I had to do all of that. I could care less about Canaan because I wanted to go after another grandkid, not Canaan. But I wanted to clear that up so that no one said anything later. And I won't probably be able to get a chance to do that. Nevertheless, I will say a couple of things. One, I mentioned before, we come from different cultures and different influences. And there are a number of people here that didn't grow up here. If you grew up here, this story here gets into something else. For many American blacks, this story is something that the evangelical groups here in the States would tell you that's why your people were involved in the European slavery, that you are less than educationally and in the system of academic pursuits. This is drilled into here. I don't know what it's like elsewhere. And so that mentality is difficult for people that use that version. Because when people use that version, that's where they're ultimately going, and properly so, because Ham had other kids, and they weren't necessarily the Nubian, all the Nubian peoples, but they fixate on Ham, and therefore they create this establishment that American blacks were deserving of some of the events that took place in history. And it accounts for some of the uh, dysfunctional attributes that may become evident in our societies, or disenfranchisement that some may go through today. And they're so adamant about it. And it's hard. So it's not new, but American blacks, I ain't too fond of that version. So it's like pouring salt in the wound for some that don't even understand the truth. And it hits home, but you would have to like grow up here to catch that. In addition, when you look at what's being said and the curses that start to spew forth, you start to get into American British Israelism, and you start to get into some other stuff. But when you look at Canaan and the children that he had, and those of the Canaanite clan, and you look at the subjugation that Noah was trying to say they were going to have to deal with in the future, when you try to figure out who could fit some of those roles, there may be others than the people that immigrated willingly or unwillingly from the continent of Africa that you might be able to attribute that to. And again, I recognize that when you look at the Canaanites, not everybody will see it that way. However, if you were to ask some of those in the Middle East, who are these peoples, they get offended. They do get offended. Nevertheless, so all of that so that I could get to the sons of Ham. The sons of Ham, chapter 10, verse 6, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. I could care less about Canaan, and I could care less about all of these other approaches and innuendos that I touched on. I say that because someone could come and throw a wrench in my pursuit of Cush and his son, Nimrod, and say that Nimrod isn't significant, but he is. And so I have to establish that. But again, I don't care about Cain, and I don't care about Put or Egypt right now, just Cush and Nimrod. So now that I've finally gotten to Nimrod, I'm going to have to wrap up. But I will say, Nimrod is a man that stemmed from the line of Cain. He did not obey God. He was an evil man. He was a tyrant. And if you read the description of him, a mighty hunter before the Lord, in place of God, is what the Hebrew means. And you see this continuance in this approach of seeing themselves as God. And that's what he did. He saw himself as a god. When you look at Josephus and you look at folklore, it says that Seth, who was still alive, killed Nimrod. There may be different versions or iterations of how people feel Nimrod came to his death. But Seth got so tired of this and killed Nimrod, cut him up in pieces, and sent him out to different groups around the world to show Nimrod is not a god, he is just a man. It is said that Nimrod was married to his mother, Semiramis. There was some talk of children having relations with their mother before, but understand that procedure was prominent in pagan societies. Hence, it needed to be addressed when God spoke to the Israelites. There's no denying this was existent with Nimrod. Good looking, appreciate it. All right. There was no denying that Nimrod had this relationship. Once he was killed, his son, help me out. Who was his son? No, yeah, Nimrod's kid. No, because not his son. Semiramis had another kid. Oh, come on, guys. Jeffrey. No, Semiramis had, what was his name? I can't remember. Nobody remembers Semiramis? Tammuz, that was it. Tammuz, which is a name that you see as you go forward in the Old Testament as being another major god. Semiramis had another child, named him Tammuz, and said that Tammuz was the reincarnation of Nimrod by his spirit. But what happens is going forward, you begin to get all of these Christmas establishments. The old religion that existed with Cain prior to the flood gets recreated again after the flood through Nimrod, through Semiramis and Tammuz. And she said that when Nimrod died, there was a tree that sprouted up out of nowhere and just became full. And this symbolized the spirit of Nimrod. And so people should take the tree and bring it in their homes and design it and put, ornaments on it. The ornaments are very phallic. Yes. The little red balls. Those are testes. And there are other things when you look at all of the decorations that are attributed to this, all stemming from the false religion that Nimrod established. But you see the progression and how people just would not obey God and how the world became so immoral. Because when you just read the Old Testament, it's like out of nowhere, everybody just going along with their life was like, you know what, I'm going to just flood the whole world. Well, where did that come from? When you read between the lines, you see the world got that bad. It got that bad. And so today, what we see is an extinction of Nimrod, an extinction of what Semiramis did, an extinction of what Tammuz has done, where people say, I don't need Zeus. I don't need all these other gods, which were really based on some of these men in the line of Cain. I'm God. And to their detriment, we don't see the true God. And at the end of it all, I don't even know how to pronounce this. Maybe the room could help me. Habakkuk? Habakkuk? Go on, look at you guys in Habakkuk feeling people. Habakkuk reading people. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 14 speaks of when the knowledge of God will spread through the whole world in the future, despite what we see today. Despite how many may figure these things originated, despite what color sneakers people wore in the past, that's not what's important. What's important is that people fell away from God and that people need to return to God. And that's what we're going to recognize in spite of how the world is celebrating a religion that just obscures the true God.